Koptlich have really given us some idea of what is happening in relation to France, Germany, Netherlands and Switzerland. And I mean, their findings are of interest to us because we have been talking very broadly in terms of the old diaspora and the new diaspora from the Indian point of view. And here is a very contemporary situation, though the numbers may be small in the countries that you have discussed, but they have a potential for future which is very important. And it is good to know what kind of thinking is going on between host countries and receiving and sending countries and so on. Thank you very much. I now invite my friend Professor Brij Maharaj, my friend of long standing from South Africa, to speak on the African brain drain, causes, costs and consequences.
मैं प्रोफेसर जैन जी को 20 साल से जानती हूँ और दिन पर दिन श्री जैन जी और जवान लगता है. I'll translate. I know Professor Jain for 20 years and this distinguished diaspora scholar seems to be getting younger by the day, so I think he needs to give us the formula.
That's the contribution of diaspora to me. Yes.
I'd like to thank Professor Patnaik and Dr. Sadanand Sahu for inviting me, and I know they accommodated me at short notice. And given the precedent set by Professor Niyai, I think I'll also tell you about my diasporic connection. I'm a third generation descendant of indentured labor, and I think my roots, as far as I could ascertain, goes back to UP in Lucknow. I've always been struck by the simplicity, humility, and the outstanding hospitality, that with which we foreigners are received in India. And I think this goes back to the Hindu philosophy of guests representing some form of higher spiritual order. And I think I'm glad that I have at least some historical genetic connection with this part of the world. I'm also pleased to note that while we are in a transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary school, the organizers, I think 3 of the 4 panelists are actually geographers. Okay, enough of introductions. I tried to be smart last night and put in this slide and no one can see it. Sorry, one more point. It's a very important point. I'm glad to see that the organizers have actually invited and supported a number of young African scholars. It's very pleasing. I think we had a chat last night and we said we are starting the intellectual revolution in Africa. I hope they decide to go home, not stay back in India. Now, this slide actually illustrates what I think the Dr. Singh spoke about, that the largest recipient of remittances globally is India, and this is a figure from World Bank, a 2011 handbook on remittances, which states that it was $55 billion US. And the second slide is also bad, but what's the point I was going to make here is the largest recipient in terms of percentage of GDP is Tajikistan, 35%, Tonga, 28%, Lesotho, 25%, and of course that obviously comes largely from my country where most of the migrants come in, and then Nepal, another mountain kingdom in which I think a number of workers are based in this part of the world. It was 22 or 23%. But to get back to my topic, we've heard this morning that globalization has been responsible for movement of people in an era where there's limited and scarce skills, and more or less 200 million people, or 3% of the global population, are migrants, and the majority of them are professionals. And more recently, the trend is for movement from the south to the north. Now, Africa has not been immune to these trends. and losing skilled migrants has serious implications for development. Vididian is an economist. He has argued that when a skilled immigrant enters a country, with him or her comes a sum of past investments as well as a stream of future revenues based on the embedded competencies of that individual. The twin effects it has for African economies are losing the best in human capital and spending money, extra money in terms of training and educating the replacements. The continent is also becoming increasingly dependent on foreign technical expertise at a cost of more than $4 billion per annum. Of course, the positive side is that there is the income in remittances, and in Africa this was about $40 billion. In 2010, it's about 2.6% of the GDP, and this is from about 30 million diasporic Africans. Of course, I think the negative consequences will reverberate across Africa and impact on the global competitiveness of the continent. Now, one of the problems of getting information about diaspora and remittances is very difficult. So I've been drawing from UN, World Bank data, the ILO and IOM for what I'm presenting. In fact, my understanding is the World Bank has a dedicated economics unit that's dealing with remittances and so on. But one thing I want to add is that the official figures that we are getting largely is from banks, so like Western Union, etc. And I think the World Bank, through its networks with banking officials and chairpersons of reserve banks, etc., are able to do this. I think if you look at what's not counted, it's likely to double. And I'll give you a personal anecdote. A few months ago, I was actually traveling from Dubai to Kerala, Kodikoza, or the old Calicut. And I landed there, and I was trying to get my bag. And I only saw boxes coming in, television sets, washing machines, etc. And I was wondering whether I'd come in a cargo plane. And academics travel frequently, and I got the sinking feeling, well, my bag is mostly going to Shanghai or something. And there was only one bag on the flight. It was my bag. It came at the end. That's an example. I think if you look at what's coming in kind, and then the money carriers, people are carrying things informally, etc. So I think the economists have got some challenges in terms of how they're going to calculate this, but that's not my job. So I want to look at an overview of the brain drain in Africa, look at some of the factors, identifying it, look at gender dimensions, and Professor Mingai spoke about that this morning as well. And assess some of the impacts and look at the implications of the brain circulation between Africa and the rest of the world. Can we manage this process? And one of my colleagues spoke about that just now. Can we reduce the movement of migrants democratically? Much over that as possible. And to what extent can this diaspora's potential be harnessed to contribute to the development in the continent? Now, there's a big debate about definitions, one of an Indian scholar and economist, I think based in the US, Bhagwati, was actually actively involved in some of these debates, and I think you know the definitions, etc., and I'm going to skip that because of time constraints. But I want to make one point in the last bullet here. The British Royal Society actually coined the term brain drain to describe the outflow of scientists and technicians from the US and Canada to the US and Canada from Britain in the 50s and early 60s. And the attraction of scholars at that time was the research grants were far bigger in the US at that time. And I know one of the doyens of geography, and since there are many geographers in this audience, Professor David Harvey. He actually moved from, I think, Oxford and Bristol and went to Johns Hopkins, etc. There's a flip side. In the period of recession, I think scholars are now thinking of moving out of the US. And when we advertise for jobs in Africa, it's pleasing to see that there are some international scholars even looking for options in Africa. So the economic dimensions should not be forgotten. Mention was made about the fact that Chinese and Indians are moving back to India and China. But you have to understand the economic context, that in the era of double-digit economic growth, etc., it becomes attractive to come back to our home country. Some statistics on the brain drain in Africa. 127,000 professionals left Africa between 1960 and 89. Since 1990, about 20,000 are moving out of Africa. About 300,000 professionals reside outside of Africa. Ethiopia lost 75% of its skilled labor force between 1980 and 91. There's a big pressure on the medical and allied health disciplines, and that's a big issue. A lot has been written and research about that area alone. For example, it costs about $40,000 to train a doctor in Kenya. It costs about $15,000 to train a university graduate in that country. Now this comes to the question of replacement cost. 35% of the overseas development assistance in Africa is spent on expatriate professionals. So if you have a grant from USAID, then if you look at the chain of financial constraints and all, you find invariably you have to give it to American consultants, etc. There are ethical questions about Western countries and more recently the Middle East recruiting medical professionals who are trained in the developing world. Female migrants have increased from 42% in 1960 to 47% in 2000. Annual remittances now exceed foreign aid and investment flows. I'll come back to that later. This is a slide that just shows the outflow of doctors from Ghana itself. 39% go to the UK and 42% to the US. So there is a sense that part of the continent is dying a slow death as people are moving out, and it seemed to be a great obstacle to the development of the continent. Now to fill in the resource gap, this is where this issue of expatriates come in, and so we're spending about 4 billion, there's a repetition here. Now Africa has only 3% of the scientists of the world, 3.6%, and the scientific output has dropped to 0.3%. Now, as you know, research, development and training is critical for countries that want to grow in a knowledge-based economy. And so we're losing our scientists, engineers, technologists. So the feminization of migrant movement is also getting some attention now. The woman's human capital is even scarcer than the male human capital. And women are moving in the areas of nursing, teaching, and the other allied disciplines and professions dominated by women. More importantly, the women send more remittances and more regularly than men. And I think this is linked to the inherent nurturing and caring nature of women. Just to look at some stats about the share of the tertiary educated workers in the labor force. Once again, in Africa, we've got less than 5%. That's really the problem. Geographers always use this notion of push-pull factors in explaining why people move, and I'll go through this very quickly. The poor socio-economic conditions, unemployment, real drops in income, devaluation of currencies, etc. Difficult government systems. We've had dictators, despots, etc. One of my colleagues was talking about Zimbabwe last night. Professional isolation, how do we connect with the latest research, etc. Although I think in an era of Google Scholar, etc., it's possible to keep in touch. Ethnic and tribal tensions and discrimination, how appointments are done, corruption, lack of freedom, etc. Higher salaries is one of the big advantages, the notion that you can have a better quality of life, more mobility for professionals, less bureaucratic controls, acquisition of greater skills, foreign scholarships. I think someone can do a real study. Look at the Fulbrights. People go and study in the US, and what proportion of the Fulbrights actually come back home. And some people argue that these type of scholarships are actually recruiting strategies to get people from the developing world. Obviously, that kind of level of academic freedom, etc., is also important. And then we have the impact of the neoliberal structural adjustment programs in Africa. It's well known that since the late 1980s, these programs were enforced by the World Bank and was a prerequisite for them getting foreign assistance. It created havoc because it led to privatization of a lot of public services. many civil servants who were trained professionals, etc., were unemployed or had to take cutbacks in salary, and this was a group that actually moved, looking for greener pastures. The World Bank was arguing that from 2005 to 2010, the remittances to sub-Saharan Africa doubled from 5 billion to 10 billion, and of course the remittances to North Africa would be even higher. The major recipient for remittances in Africa was Nigeria, and I think I suspect that Nigeria has one of the largest diasporic presence outside Africa. Now the expenditure has largely been on land, housing, education, agriculture. I think sometimes there's been a tendency to inflate the benefits associated with remittances. It tends to be largely spent on consumer goods, and the multipliers are largely limited. In this slide you can see that from the 2000 onwards, as the economic recession began to bite, official foreign aid went down, and you can see that there is a upward trajectory, continuous upward trajectory in recorded remittances, and of course foreign direct investment is continuously going down, and this is for Africa between 1990 and 2010. And a similar pattern replicates itself when one looks at remittance flows through the developing world. So that pattern is very similar. Reduction in FDIs, reduction in overseas development aid, but an increase in remittances. There was a minor hit between 2007 and 2008, but it seems to be moving up again. One of the problems, and I don't have time to go into the details here, is how flows of income in the form of remittances is blocked because it's difficult. The actual cost of transferring money from other parts of the world to Africa and the developing world is high. How many people have bank accounts in rural areas? So the lack of accounts. Some people don't have valid IDs. So there's a range of formal restrictions on the way in which the formal channels for remittances could be used, and then hence my point made earlier that more and more people make use of the informal channels. And I think a key concern of this conference and the organizers and sponsors is policy options. What do we do? There's been a great deal of debate about whether it's possible to or necessary to stop, control, or regulate the outflow of migrants. Dr. Singh told us that in a democracy it's very difficult. People make choices. So one has to look at, and certainly the framework from which I operate is a democratic, human rights-based framework. So until the 80s, the late 80s, the policy response was to control and regulate the flow of migrants, and this was unsuccessful. It's well known now that restrictive policies are counterproductive. They encourage irregular migration. I don't think we have time to go into this whole issue of irregular migration. It's something we should come up in the final session maybe. And then it also can be seen as violating rights of people and limiting democratic options. The other option has been to actually look at reparations or compensation in the form of the loss of skill, labor, human capital, and some amount should be paid back to the sending country, and one of my colleagues spoke about that earlier as well. So is it possible to levy a form of expatriate tax? And there were two possible forms. The immigrant could be taxed at a higher rate, or the receiving country should pay compensation or reparations. And this, the expectation was the additional income would be used for development projects. A major problem was the difficulty in determining the actual amount and how it should be calculated. Now there are two main policy strategies for African countries to turn brain drain into brain gain. The first is to try to retain professionals. Providing attractive incentives would encourage professionals to return to the country of origin, or using the networks and associations to promote and foster development in the country of origin. So the return option, here the concern was to provide incentive packages to retain professionals in the country. So for example, salary, subvention, housing and transport allowances, healthcare insurance, as well as tax concessions, and even providing access to these imported consumer goods. Now, I come from the university world and I know a lot about movement of academics. There was a view that universities in Africa should allow academics to serve as consultants, and this would provide the top up for salaries. Now, I can tell you the problem in this. Some of you might know Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, who's from Uganda, moved to Colombia, and recently decided to come back to Makerere to try to build up a critical tradition of scholarship in African universities. Now, a number of us based in different parts of Africa have that common agenda. And what Mamdani said recently was that he found that there was a corrosive consultancy culture that has led to the movement of seminars from the classroom to the five-star hotels. And you know the implications for critical scholarship. Now, outside of Africa, the Asian Tigers in the 1980s were very successful in attracting people back. Once again, the point I made earlier, when the Asian Tigers were ruling, they had this huge growth, economic growth in the 80s, and before we had the crash of 87, I think, or 97, sorry, 97. It was the economic growth in home countries that led people to go back. So an example is given. In the early 60s, less than 1/5 of South Korean students who completed doctorates in the US in science and engineering returned. By the 1980s, 75% are moving. And when you see the success of a Samsung or a Hyundai, etc., you can see where it's going. Now, the reference was made about India, and I'm not going to go into the details there. Now the point, this is the point. In most instances, return occurred when there was a recession in the host country and economic boom in the country of origin. However, the African experience with return migration has enjoyed very limited success. This was because the vast majority of African countries have not reached the point where they can attract significant numbers of returnees, nor could they accommodate the returnees large numbers. They don't have sufficient jobs, etc. There is acknowledgement that most migrants were unlikely to return, but have an interest in supporting growth and development in the home country. Now, the African diaspora can support connections, networks of skilled professionals between host countries and the African continent, facilitate exchange of information, knowledge and technology, and offer research expertise, consultancies, and so on. And some countries have been trying to do this. My own country, South Africa, which has had a different type of exodus because a lot of white professionals felt threatened by democracy, and they went across. But since the recession, the story is last in, first out. A number of these professionals were unemployed, etc. And certainly engineers, etc. were able to sign employment contracts in South Africa over the internet. So there are other examples, Nigeria, Ghana, etc. Overall, the diaspora influence has been largely small scale, focused on families, neighborhoods, and largely outside of the purview of government structures. Some concluding points. While there may be moral arguments against the brain drain, globalizing market forces as well as rapidly deteriorating social, economic and political conditions are dominant drivers of what can be perceived to be a self-perpetuating vicious cycle. Some positive outcomes include the flow of remittances from immigrants to Africa, the transfers of some technology and skills. It is very evident that the brain drain from Africa is unlikely to be stopped or catered in the short to medium term. Incentives to return to the home country receive lukewarm responses because conditions which initiated the decision to migrate have further deteriorated. Restrictive migration policies have been largely unsuccessful. Neither have calls for declaration or compensation from receiving to sending countries being successful. The challenge for African countries is to exploit the perceived advantages, that means remittances, diaspora connections, etc., from what many consider to be a negative process. Thank you.
Thank you.